Thank you so much for joining this session. My name is Christian Vermeulen. I am a neurophysiologist. I specialize in the neuroscience of learning, understanding the brain, how the brain sort of processes information, and then how it then translates into us increasing our performance, increasing the way that we go about things, and just in its entirety, trying to help the corporate world and the working world to be better versions of themselves. The session that we'll be discussing today is neuroplasticity, rewire your thinking in times of uncertainty. So, as you all know, that we have been going through quite a lot of disruptive changes in the last few months, actually a few years. And sometimes it does get a bit too much for us. It feels like it gets a bit too much for us. And this world, we refer to it as a VUCA world. It's a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. And there's so many disruptive changes that's happening in this world. And we need to try and be in the forefront of things. We need to try and be as adaptive and flexible in our thinking as much as we can in order to not just survive in this world, but to actually thrive in this world. So this gives us the opportunity. The opportunity is looking at this situation of disruptive change as a positive opportunity and not looking at it from a negative perspective. We sometimes first, when we experience that change, we first want to look into the negative parts of things, and we sometimes have this way, and that's how the brain also is processes information, because it's trying to protect you from these changes, because it's not used to these changes. But our habits have become frozen, and we are actually being forced out of these habits through these disruptive changes. But the great thing is that life and tomorrow and love and relationships and the people that we work with and hope has not been cancelled, is not something that is aversive or negative, that we should be that we should focus on negative areas, rather on these positive aspects. But the uncertainty in the world is bringing this opportunity, helping us break these habits and dealing with the behaviors that we should have been trying to break for years now. We now have that opportunity to rethink who we are, what life is about, why we get up in the morning, what we're living for, and where we put our energies. We need to make sure that we start rewiring our thinking and focus on those positive aspects in life, and not just trying to first focus on those negative aspects to get through the stress or the pressure situation. First, build a little bit of motivation. Just give the brain a little bit of a chance to build that motivation, to increase the way we have the outlook, the positive outlook we have in situations, in life, in experiences and interactions with individuals. So take this as an opportunity, and don't see this as a negative that's going to have a bad influence in who we are or what's going to happen. So this brings me to the next point here, and this is a beautiful analogy to understand what neuroplasticity is all about. And if we look at this picture here, you'll see that this is round about the normal way that a brain should look like. It has all the compartments, the neocortex, it has the cerebellum, it has all those sections that you see here. But what I'm going to show you now is a scan of an individual that actually does not have a cerebellum. And that is where you'll see that black dot in the brain section here, around about at the back, at the back side of the brain, a little bit here in the center. That's where you see that there's no structure there. There's no cerebellum. And this is the story that I want to tell you. A few years ago, there was a person from China, and she had a few headaches. She was quite nauseous, a little bit dizzy, and she went to the emergency room, and they could not find what was wrong with why she's experiencing these symptoms. And after a few tests and things, they decided to do a brain scan. And what they found was that she did not have a cerebellum. And that is, it flabbergasted these doctors, because the cerebellum is primarily used for our balance, our posture. Some areas of movement are also controlled in the cerebellum. So it's very important for us to have the cerebellum in order for us to function in life, to actually do what we are doing at this moment. But this was very weird to these doctors, because there was no noticeable issues with this individual. There were no difficulties. She was as normal as could be. There was nothing wrong. She had 2 children. She had a job that she was actually performing quite well in. But this sort of gave rise to understanding what this neuroplasticity is all about, and understanding how this actually happened. And this is a perfect analogy of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to make new connections, to rewire or reorganize those neural pathways and synapses when we learn, when we think, when we experience certain things in life. And that's how we start making those connections, and we make more connections in order to have associations, to pool all the information that we come across every day, so that we actually prioritize that information. One thing that we also need to understand here of this specific scan is the cerebellum contains about 50% of the neurons or the brain cells in the human brain. So they didn't know how that was possible, but they established that it was possible through neuroplasticity. The top part of the brain took over the functions of that cerebellum. The brain rewired in terms of those functions that's needed for her to function in society. And that's the great news that I want to give you today, is you are able to change your thinking. I'm not saying that it's easy. It's sometimes very difficult to change our thinking, but we need to put in the hard work if we want to change those habits, if we want to change our thinking. But when we look at neuroplasticity, there are 3 main categories. These 3 main categories are short-term. So these are more biochemical changes. Then you get your medium-term changes, which are your structural changes. And then you get long-term neuroplasticity, which is your functional changes. Now, the analogy or the example that I gave you of the person without the cerebellum, that's more of an example of those functional changes. But those functional changes happened because of first going through the short-term changes and then the medium-term medium-term sort of structural changes, and then resulted in those functional changes happening. So we'll go into a bit more detail as we move through the presentation of each aspect of neuroplasticity. But I want to give you the opportunity to check out your agility, to see how the compartments in your brain is functioning with one another, and let's see how you perform on this exercise. And please try it with me in this video, please. Great. So you've had a chance to do this activity, and this also is about neuroplasticity. You'll start to actually develop those neural pathways to do these specific activities without any hesitation. And if there was hesitation, that's not an issue at all. If you keep on doing these activities, it will increase your brain fitness and the communication between the two hemispheres that's trying to process two different pieces of information in two different visual fields at the same time. We need to keep on stimulating the brain to help these changes to happen. But before we get into the structural type of changes, let's first look at these biochemical changes. So if we look at the brain cell, you'll see here that the picture here with all those labels, that's the entire brain cell, or what we refer to it as a neuron. And this neuron has what we call dendrites, and these dendrites are those like little branches that's stemming out from that a circle of the cell. And then we have like a tail-like structure of the brain cell, which we call the axon. And then we have the terminals. These are axon terminals where there's a release of chemicals, and those chemicals are released into a space between your brain cells, which is called the synaptic cleft, and that's where a synapse occurs. These chemicals then actually bind to the next neuron in order to generate an electrical impulse. So the more we actually, so if we generate that electrical impulse and it moves to moves through the neuron to the terminal, it then causes a reaction to occur, and it releases those chemicals, and those chemicals are those chemicals are called neurotransmitters, and some of those chemicals could be or neurotransmitters could be excitatory, or they could be inhibitory neurotransmitters. So all of those neurotransmitters has a different effect in how it activates the next brain cell. But this is how our brain works. It's a pathway of these brain cells or neurons that connect, and that then helps or causes us to think and learn and be plastic in our thinking, in our learning. But what happens here is there's a full passing of those chemicals through to the next brain cell. But sometimes what happens is when we experience, for example, stress is a hormone called cortisol that's released in the body by your adrenal glands, and that cortisol then moves into your bloodstream, and then it causes a cascade of chemical events to occur. So there's different neurotransmitters or those chemicals that's released by the terminal of that brain cell that could have a negative impact in relaying that electrical impulse to the next brain cell. Now, it's not just these chemicals. These chemicals might attract or activate other brain cells that are more inhibitory neurons or brain cells. So it becomes quite a bit complicated, but in summary, this is how that works. When we experience those stresses, we tend to sort of not understand why we're not performing in the way that we are performing. If we experience those changes, we don't exactly know why, where and how we're going to do this and find the solutions. And that's because our brain goes into a specific mode of processing that information and activates and deactivates through certain neurons and chemicals the way in which we process or conduct those electrical impulses and those release those chemicals. So here you'll see that they won't pass through as easy as they should be passing through. And it doesn't mean that these chemicals can't connect to the dendrites on the next cell at all. Some of them do, but it's not the correct concentration of these chemicals to move to that next neuron, to have the right, what they call action potential to generate that electrical impulse. So sometimes it might be a little bit weaker. And that's where it sort of causes those difficulties in our thinking. And that's where we start reinforcing negative type of thinking, because it takes a lot of effort to have those concentrations in at the right level. But looking at those chemicals that actually cause a sort of inhibiting effect of those electrical impulses and the different concentrations of those chemicals, we need to now understand that the way in which we talk, the way in which how we experience situations, or the way in which we think, has an influence in the neurotransmitters that's being released. And if those neurotransmitters are not at the right concentration, it might have a negative impact, and that would then cause us to not have a sort of full access or to the full potential of that electrical impulse to occur to the next neuron and activate the pathway that we wanted to activate at that time. It then starts stimulating a new pathway, which will reinforce that negative behavior. So when we experience negative emotions, when we are pessimistic, when we experience that stress and fatigue, it causes this type of occurrence to occur within the brain. These are just biochemical changes, but as we see with neuroplasticity, these biochemical changes, when done a lot, or it becomes a habit, then it becomes sort of structural changes, and then it actually translates into functional changes where we don't believe in ourselves. We have very limiting types of mindsets, and not progressive growth type of mindset. So, but one of the impacts that these biochemical changes also have, it also influences our immune function. So this is not the correct fuel that we need to be focusing on. So with these changes that we experience, try to focus on the positive, because the positive emotions are going to help you to motivate the brain. The brain is not going to feel that it's going to expend so much energy, and it's going to be more of an optimistic type of thinking and situation for the brain, helping the brain to be ready to actually find those solutions, to be ready in these times of uncertainty. So we need to be relaxed, and we need to, if we flourish, it's going to help us to release the correct concentrations of these neurotransmitters, neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, and they all work with different concentrations for different emotions, but we need to keep them at those correct concentration levels so that we do have optimal electrical impulses to run through the entire a neural network or brain cell network for that specific thinking pathway. So this would actually have a good effect on our immune functioning. And this is the correct fuel. These are feel-good chemicals. And when you eat a piece of chocolate, we feel good. When we eat too much chocolate, yes, we might feel a little bit not so good. But when you eat that chocolate, you have a burst of these neurotransmitters, and it's rewarding systems. It's the rewarding systems in the brain, and this is what we need to feed off. When it's rewarding, it actually stimulates this pathway a bit more, but it takes a bit more energy. And remember that the brain tries to conserve energy and it tries to protect us from these changes. So yes, it's going to take a little bit more effort, but once you start to stimulate that, it's going to be a bit more easier. But when we look at the next section of neuroplasticity, that's where we look at these structural changes in the neural pathway. So we spoke about the dendrites, we spoke about the brain cell. Now, when we experience anything in the world, learning or experiences that we go through, our dendrites connect. So they connect with those biochemicals, and then what happens is that electrical impulse moves through the neuron, and it releases more chemicals to the next neuron, and so on, and then it actually creates a neural pathway. And when this neural pathway is formed, it is formed. So it could be a negative pathway, or it could be a positive type of pathway. It all depends on what we are feeding ourselves in our thinking. But when we start to reinforce these pathways, if I keep on telling myself, I can't do this, I've already started the dendrites connected, it actually established that neural pathway, and it starts being formed. But the more I tell myself that I cannot do this, the more I reinforce this pathway, and now I start forming that specific mindset. But then it gets to a stage where when I am in that situation, that sort of reminds me of maybe I can't do this. Even if I start thinking, maybe I can't do this, it becomes an automatic response. I start moving into that negative pathway, and it establishes that negative pathway. It keeps on reinforcing it. It becomes such an automatic process that's how it then forms our mindset and our attitude. That's the way that we then habitually start to think. But when we now look at this statement that you see here, whether you think you can or you can't, you are right. That's what Henry Ford said. I love this statement. And sometimes I speak to people and they say, I can't do this. And I tell them, whether you think you can or you can't, you are right, because you are limiting yourself in your own thinking. You are releasing those chemicals that's not conducive for you to actually repattern and get through this. You are allowing yourself just to fall into those already established pathways of maybe I can't do this. I won't be able to do this. And then it starts to translate into other areas of your life, not just the specific thing that you initially formed that pathway with, because the brain makes associations. As soon as the situation or the change becomes too much, it reminds the brain of the negative pathway that you've already created, because it's trying to find a cheat to get out of that situation as quickly as possible to conserve energy, but also to protect you in that time. So remember, whether you think you can or you can't, you are right. I always tell people, you don't always have to, at first, believe that you'll be able to do this. But the more you tell yourself that, you actually program your brain and form another neural pathway to repattern over that negative pathway that you've created. That takes a lot of time. If you've been programming your brain that you can't do something for years, that's going to take a lot of time to reprogram it to say, but I can do it. Even if you don't always 100% believe it, the more you say it and the more you tell yourself that you can do it, it gives the brain the motivation and energy to take on those changes, the uncertainties that you experience. So the point is here that we need to build constructive mindsets. This is looking at situations from a growth perspective, to look at a situation and be grateful in that time, to also be confident and efficient and be creative in how you take on these uncertain times. Look for the opportunities and not just the problems that we have here. There's always a great way of understanding when we, just by the words that we use, we actually program our brains. If we start saying that something is a problem, it already indicates to the brain that this is going to take a lot of time, it's going to take a lot of effort, and I'm going to expend a lot of energy. So why should I actually do this? And it's not motivating the brain, it's motivating the brain to fall into those negative mindsets that we have already established. We need to get out of that. We need to release those neurotransmitters at the correct levels so that we have optimal functioning between our brain cells. So finding the opportunity and using the words like, instead of using the word, this is a problem, when I actually use that word and the brain gets demotivated, as opposed to, this might be challenging. It might be challenging. But can you see that the word challenging already feels a little bit more something that I can deal with, that the brain can deal with, to find a solution that's not going to take that much time, or that it feels that I just want to take a shortcut out of this to get out of this situation. Check the words that you are using and the way that you are looking at these uncertain times that we are living in. So looking at these destructive mindsets, when we think in from a limited point of view, if we limit our way of thinking that I can't do this, or I won't be able to do this, or I'll never do, don't allow yourself to move into activating those neural pathways. Try to not reinforce those pathways more. Try to repattern it and be actively aware of your thinking, metacognition, thinking about your thinking. Don't be fearful. Yes, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't be realistic. Sometimes there are certain situations that's going to elicit fear, or maybe elicit that negative type of thinking. But we need to keep on trying to make the choice to actually engage and stimulate the positive thinking pathways, rather than feeding the negative thinking pathways. This takes me to, if we look at constructive mindsets, this is feeding that, what we call the good wolf. And then if we start being negative in our thinking and very limiting in our thinking, that's where we start feeding that bad wolf. And we need to feed the good wolf much more than the bad wolf. I know that sometimes it's going to be difficult, and we're not perfect. We're not perfect, but we need to try at least to make sure that we still feed that good wolf as much as we can in a realistic way. So destructive mindsets are your bad fuel, and they are not going to help you to be on the forefront of these adversities or these uncertain times changes and disruptive change that we experience in today's world. So the key here is to be optimistic. When we are pessimistic, it feels like there's no hope. That's what pessimism is about. We're very fearful, and that demotivates the brain. It's putting the brain in a situation, it's almost cornering the brain where it feels like, okay, the only way that I can get out of this situation is to go into my old behaviors, because that's what I know, that's what I've actually established. And then I'm going to keep on getting the same results. But when I am optimistic, I am hopeful. When I am hopeful, I motivate the brain, I give the brain motivation to get through this situation. But it's helping me to have a better neural access in those pathways. They're communicating much more effectively with one another so that we can get through these difficult times and actually build onto those neural pathways and networks to even strengthen them more, to make more positive associations than those negative type of associations. Remember that, yes, we need to also take into account reality. Sometimes there are certain things that just, in terms of being realistic, we need to be realistic, but try to focus on the positives and the being an optimist first and generating a hopeful type of thinking than being pessimistic. So when we look at mindsets, when we experience or when we come across information in our environment, the physical eye sort of takes in what research indicates is for most people, not all people, but for the norm, takes in about 6% of that information. But I'm also referring, that's the physical information that they come across. But then that physical information gets processed in the brain, and that's where 94% of that information is actually processed, but it's processed within our inner reality. It does not necessarily mean that we saw the correct thing in context. But now we also need to understand that research also indicates that because we're only human, everyone makes mistakes, that with that 6%, that we see with our physical eye, 72% of that information could be inaccurate information. It might be assumptions that we've made that becomes our inner reality. It could be experiences that's taken out of context, which forms our inner reality, and that makes it very difficult for us to actually try and change those pathways. So we need to understand that our actions are going to follow our thoughts. And if those thoughts are not good thoughts, or if they are not the thoughts that we want people, or how we the thoughts that we don't not necessarily want to think, that's going to come out. So understanding that we need to have our thoughts right, and then it's going to start adjusting what we put out in the world and how we take on the world and these uncertainties and these changes that we're experiencing. What real mind power is taking charge of your thinking, your emotions, your actions, and those circumstances. So just to indicate here, Ian Weinberg said, when you change the way you think, you change your perception of reality. When you change your perception of reality, you change your expectations. When you change your expectations, you change your attitude. And when you change your attitude, you start changing your behavior, as I just mentioned. When you change your behavior, you start changing your performance. And when you change your performance, you start changing your life. And that's the point that we're trying to make with neuroplasticity, is you will be able to change your life and the way that you go about things in difficult times with your thinking, the way that you take control. You need to be in control of your thinking in in control of your emotions, and that will translate into your behaviors, and build onto having a much better performance in these difficult and uncertain times. So here's another activity that I want you to go through. Let's see if you can do this one with me. So well done for trying to do this activity with me. And remember, if there's a little bit of hesitation and you can't get it right the first time, it's all okay. There's nothing wrong with it. You keep on doing these activities, and that will stimulate those neural pathways to be formed, to actually get and keep on reinforcing them so that they do become automatic behavior, because that is going to translate into your performance, the way you take on challenges in the world that you live. So, how do we overcome this? How do we actually sort of change our thinking? And the first step here is to have accurate self-awareness. Sometimes it's not nice for us to think that there's something wrong, or there's something that I need to change about myself. But we need to find quiet time and do an honest assessment of ourselves. You need to listen to your own soundtrack. I normally say that your thinking is like your own soundtrack, and the pictures that you have is then like the movie. So having the sound in the movie, but I want to challenge you on this. Would you release? Would you, if this was a virtual type of world, would you let other people download that soundtrack, download those pictures that you have in your mind, your mindsets? Or would you feel that there's a little bit of things that I actually can change? You need to identify these areas and acknowledge these behaviors and mindsets that need to change, or that's not conducive for you to move forward in this uncertainty, in these times of uncertainty. But you also need to remember that you should be brutally honest with yourself. It's not going to help you not be, if you are not brutally honest, you're just cheating yourself and giving yourself sort of a confidence boost that everything is okay. Everyone has something to learn. Everyone has something that they can work on in their lives. No one's perfect, but it's gonna be your responsibility to take on that effort, to make sure that you really move into understanding what are those things that you need to change in terms of your mindset. Identify them, but also be realistic. Don't try and change mindsets that's too big. Do small incremental changes. Remember that the brain wants to work on small incremental changes. If it's too abrupt changes, it's not really going to stay to the point of going of trying to make these changes. And then also take responsibility for the truth. Secondly, you need to exercise the power of choice. In science, we know that for every action, there's a reaction. So the great thing about people and our thinking and mindsets is, and trying to change our thinking or reinvent our thinking, is we have the power of choice. We can choose how this is, what the outcome is going to be. We need to understand that research tells us that the average person makes about 35,000 choices every day. Now, these could be small little choices or decisions that you need to make. You need to make a decision to get out of bed. You need to make a decision to write something down or to eat something. It's a lot of things to do, but you need to make the right choices. Exercise the power of choice to stimulate growth mindsets, constructive mindsets. That's going to help you in times of uncertainty, in times of change, and the things that you might be experiencing in your life. And then step 3 is to reinforce those neural pathways. The way that we reinforce these neural pathways is when we say it to ourselves, so that we have verbal affirmations. When we see it, visualize those goals. And then an important factor is, I told you that you don't always necessarily have to believe it at first. But when you start taking this pathway and you say it and you see it and you experience and you do it and you actually experience it from an emotional point of view as well, you are actually changing those structural pathways so that you actually get to those functional pathways or functional changes to get those behaviors that you want to see yourself having in the world and live to that potential that you know you have. And then lastly, believe it. Keep on believing. Believing is going to give the brain the motivation to take on these difficult times or these difficult situations that you find yourself in or that you experience in everyday life. It could be small little things that needs a big decision. So with every single opportunity of making a decision, try to make the most conducive, constructive decision rather than just sort of giving up. So my challenge is to go on a negative thought fast. Think about your thinking and listen to your own soundtrack. You need to pay attention to those pictures in your mind, and you need to be aware of those bad wolf type of thoughts. Understand what those bad wolf thoughts and words and feelings are. And now you need to start dealing with them by repatterning them and giving yourself the opportunity to make the right choice and feed the good wolf. You need to reinforce the constructive alternatives constantly. You need to keep on reinforcing those good wolf thoughts constantly until they become automatic behaviors. Refuse to think or visualize negative thoughts. All right. If you can't say something constructive, just don't say it at all. Try not to even think it, because the more you also think it, you're actually stimulating that pathway. So tips is here to create quiet time for contemplation. Journal the why, the solutions, and your plan of action. Spend time and energy on the things that you can change, and don't spend time on the things that you don't have control over. Don't cause yourself to go into a stressed state, because we already know what the biochemical outcome of that is, and it's not a very good outcome. So don't allow yourself to get stressed about things that's out of your control. Challenge yourself and stretch your limits in the way that you think. Choose not to be a victim, and make appropriate and right decisions, and keep on learning, keep on trying to find ways of being better and knowing better, and be thankful for those small mercies and stay hopeful. Love others and give them some quality time. Tell them why you love them. And something that's great is also to laugh. That releases those feel-good neurotransmitters. So the plan of action is which mindsets do you need to change? Prioritize the mindsets you wish to change, and how will you measure if your mindsets have changed? So you need to keep on trying to see where you are. How can I do this? So keep on, and that's where you get to those occurrences. You need to get there. So just a final thought from my side is now is the time to think of others, to become more alive, to think about our mission, our purpose, to be better husbands, wives, parents, employees, CEOs, and citizens. Take advantage of this time and see this as an opportunity and challenge those habits and those behaviors and replace them with a constructive alternatives. Thank you so much for joining this session. It was a pleasure in sharing this information with you, and may you change your mindsets to constructive mindsets and be ready for any uncertainty that you might face in the future, or that you are maybe facing at this moment. Thank you so much.